International Conference on Migration, Diaspora and Development organized by Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism.
I'm going to talk about Afghan and Rohingya refugees in India, so it will be a comparative study on two refugee groups in India and their social networks, how they use their social networks, how they create and recreate their social networks in India, and of course through social networks their survival strategies. So if we see this is like the summary of my presentation. So my main focus is to explore how social networks of these two different refugee groups in India work by applying the concept of social capital after Bourdieu. So it's based mainly on qualitative research, but also I use some secondary research mainly done on Afghans and also some media reports and refugees or NGO reports on Rohingyas especially. And it's also, this research is based on particular observation for 2 years in various cities in India. And in order to understand the Rohingya situation better, I also visited Bangladesh and which are working on with both communities like Access, that's the name of the NGO, Don Bosco, Zakat Foundation, and Kova in Hyderabad. So let me give you a brief theoretical framework, what I mean by social capital and the use of social networks. So researchers, especially migration scholars, have always underscored the significance of social networks in international migration. And then social capital, it's a metaphor used to describe social ties as a form of capital, is closely linked with social networks and is defined as the sum of the resources, actual or virtual, that accrue to an individual or a group by virtue of possessing a durable network of more or less institutionalized relationships of mutual acquaintance and recognition after Bourdieu and Lacan. So social capital then focuses on social networks or social relations and structures as resources that can facilitate a well-functioning society through trust networks, shared norms, and mutual obligations. And so social networks, we can say, especially international migration, but also in forced migration, they're important in the countries of origin for adaptation in the host country. They're also important in transit countries, and they're also important in the countries of destination. So they comprise of complex networks of family members and friends and kin, and in the home country and outside the home country, that can affect potential migrants' decisions to migrate. This is how it was used, actually, the concept or the theory of social capital in international migration studies. Why is it important? Because most researchers focus on how social networks provide assistance to refugees and or economic migrants, and how social networks again facilitate adjustment to new surroundings in the context, within the context of the host country, and how also social networks can spearhead the ethnic community development again in the host society. So most recently, though, social networks are taken as interlinking units of analysis, and they have received the greatest attention in migration studies so far. So with this, the migrant as a decision maker comes into focus, okay? And then of course, with the anthropologies focus on concern with theorizing the relationship between structure and agency. So migrant comes into focus, and social networks then provide a deeper understanding of how migration flows and are perpetuated despite changes in economic and political policies that constrain or halt that flows of people. However, here my point is, especially with this research, comparative research between Afghans and Rohingyas, suggests a more critical understanding of social networks and social capital theory is necessary in understanding the situation, especially in forced migration. I will explain you how. I'll try to explain this very briefly. 10 minutes, I don't know, will not do much justice, but through variables in the organization of migrant networks. So when I started my research, and I didn't know too much what to expect really. So, but after my research, I realized there are certain variables in the organization of these two refugee groups, and these are some of them are macro variables, and like the current migration and asylum policies in the West and also in India. The other micro variable is the setting or the place-specific variables, and the third one is transnational links in globalization. How, and this is linked with the social networks of these two refugee groups. And there are also micro variables, though, in organizing social networks. The first one is religion. The second one is gender. And I just say and explain you briefly on each variable here. The first one is the current migration asylum policies in the West and India. So one of the reasons that India was chosen as a country of asylum by the respondents was the difficulty of reaching the West due to restrictive policies, obviously. So most of the Afghan respondents entered India after selling their property and belongings, and Rohingyas secured finances either through their savings or from their relatives living elsewhere. So as stated by other researchers in different settings and for different refugee groups, it seems that the very poor are not the first to migrate. So I saw also among these refugee groups, immigration was a planned process for those who had access to resources, economic resources. So whether they planned their migration beforehand, it was a well-planned event or not, most of the respondents had no way of knowing how long the asylum process could take, or what really asylum was. They had no idea about this process. They were also not aware that India was not a signatory of the 1951 Geneva Convention on Refugees. So as you know, India is not signed as the other countries in the region and did not sign the Geneva Convention on Refugees, and therefore the UNHCR office here in India, in New Delhi, has no representation status like other UN offices. So they had in fact a very troubled ship in 1970s, and then this led to a brief even closure by the end of 1970s of UNHCR office in India. Now, Indian authorities come up with ad hoc policies to deal with refugee situations, but somehow practice the principle of non-refoulement, which is not sending the asylum seekers and refugees back to their countries of origin if they think that their lives might be in danger. However, on certain refugee groups like Pakistani Hindus and Tibetans, the agency again has no say whatsoever, and for the Sri Lankan Tamils, UNHCR only handles their repatriation process. But having said that, of course, India hosts many refugees, as you know. Some say 2.5 lakh, or even more than 4 lakhs. And now we can go to place-specific factors. The effects of the political instability, regime change, and turmoil that characterizes many of India's neighbors makes the country a desirable destination for many, including Afghanis. And proximity is another factor, for example. And for many Afghanis, and they claim that India, getting a tourist visa in India, for India is very easy. So many of these asylum seekers and refugees from Afghanistan enter India as a tourist and then apply for asylum. And then there's also, I cannot go too much into detail to describe the history of the Afghani migration to India. It's a long history, and also Rohingyas, but there is a large existing social networks of Afghanis here in Delhi and elsewhere. So in a way, they're following the beaten paths of relatives and friends who had chosen to come to India in the past. So there are already existing social networks, and the information on the country they gather some information on the country before immigration or before seeking asylum. This is one of the main reasons of Afghani refugees coming to India. It's a different story for Rohingyas, and because many of the Rohingya refugees here in India actually either transited through Bangladesh or lived in Bangladesh for some time before entering India. So the Rohingyas. Maybe you heard about the Rohingya situation, but in case you haven't, so they're the displaced people from Myanmar, and they're not also considered as one of the ethnicities in Bangladesh, but many of the Rohingyas today live in Bangladesh in different cities, but usually close to the Myanmar border. And over the summer, there were many incidents of the boat people actually dying in the near Malaysia, Thailand, etc., or they were stranded in these or in the seas. So it seems that the Rohingyas, for example, use the human smugglers to enter India. But then once they enter India, they can easily get on a bus or some kind of transportation to come to New Delhi or to go to where the other relatives live, like Jammu Kashmir, for example, Hyderabad. Recently, they also live in Chennai and New Delhi and Haryana region. So one important concept related to social networks I would like to mention here in social capital is embeddedness and convertibility of social capital. And social capital is a product of embeddedness and may carry hidden or explicit costs. But in the case of my respondents in India with very limited resources who cannot pay back in any form, migrant networks do not always create social capital. That's my criticism of social capital. So, in other words, individuals may not automatically assist each other simply because they are relatives, friends, or co-ethnics. So the kinds of resources available to immigrants also matter. If immigrants do not have access to desirable goods, or when there is a scarce state for available resources and information, no matter how strong their ties are, it may not yield any benefits. And then let me mention about the transnational links and globalization. It seems that most of the respondents in India were able to maintain transnational networks and connections by establishing personal relationships with trans-migrants and or relatives and friends who migrated before them. They also engaged in economic and social transnational activities. So at the economic level, there are lots of money transfers or remittances, and family, close friends, and relatives at home and outside India send remittances, usually just to help them survive. And so the amounts could be as low as $50 or could be high as $500, and to pay for the journey, so-called journey remittances for the human smugglers. So we see that there's a bridging effect of transnationalism among Afghani refugees, mostly, since they have more contacts with their transnational links. So as Castells points out, the global system is a network society connecting people beyond time and space. Although you know that the term transnationalism is nothing from new, and in today's world, globalization advances in communications and transportation make transnational ties of migrants much more visible. But again, transnational networks, however, may weaken, and when immigrants or asylum seekers or refugees, for that matter, do not have much to share due to physical and material limitations or conditions. Some respondents, for example, could not receive much assistance from their relatives who have been living in Western Europe and North America, mainly due to lacking resources. For this reason, both groups have to recreate, both Rohingyas and Afghanis have to recreate their symbolic social capital by entering into new relations in India. Religion is a micro variable here. It's a very important point because, as you know, that religious networks and getting support from religious institutions are quite important in migration. And one of the impacts of long asylum-seeking procedures, in addition to being in limbo, mistrust towards Islam and towards other co-ethnics, perhaps practiced in the country of origin by Taliban, especially I'm talking about on Afghan refugees, on Afghan respondents, is on their belief systems. So what I realized within these 2 years of research is that some of these Afghani refugees are converting into evangelical Christianity. So what happened is that they established their little churches, so-called, kind of homes, inside their homes sometimes, very small churches, or in the basements of some apartments. And interestingly enough, I'll get there later, but so they built up new social networks. So interestingly, among these new social networks, through conversion, and they meet regularly with other Westerners. I mean, like missionaries, obviously, especially from America, but also other European countries, and even there are some Koreans are involved, and they rely on membership, but they still rely on membership from their own community, but also they rely on Westerners coming and visited them regularly. Not only Westerners, but also the Indian. Co-religionists. And Rohingyas, on the other hand, get support from Indian Muslim NGOs, and they usually go to madrasas nearby to get Islamic education. Gender is another factor in building social capital within migrant networks or refugee networks, because women's networks are horizontal, as described in other sociological material, horizontal as opposed to men's vertical access. And they spend more time, women spend more time with their co-ethnics and co-religionists, and they share information. And single women, there are many single women and single mothers, and especially female-headed households in India among the both Rohingya and Afghani, mainly Afghani community. And of course, they are disadvantaged in some ways, but interesting enough, they're also in a better situation to seek help from NGOs working for them, and even from UNHCR. Ethnicity is another thing, is another macro variable, and like Afghani refugees carry their multi-ethnic cosmos to India. And interestingly, I talk about these converted cases, and interestingly enough, even the churches, small churches, with 20, maximum 30 people each, and these are also differentiated along these ethnic lines. So there's a Tajik church, there's a Pashtun church, and there's a Hazara church, even in Delhi, New Delhi. So Afghani core is divided, okay, I said that. And Rohingyas are a more homogeneous group, so there is more bonding social capital among them. After all, the reason why they had to leave Myanmar and then Bangladesh in the first place was because of their ethnic and religious identity. So it became like a factor uniting and reuniting them here also in India. And if I conclude, and in the migration literature, it is quite well established that interpersonal networks are a source of social capital. But as I said, we have to be critical about these social networks and when and how they work. And when there is lack of trust, when there is scarcity of certain goods and access to information, they're not working. They're not automatically resulting in a form of social capital, or they are not always beneficial beneficial for the refugees in question. So this research indicates that although existing social networks among refugees in India lower the initial cost of migration, they cannot be relied upon for support at all times. But it seems that for Afghanis, there is this bridging effect of social capital, meaning that they have to actually establish different ties with Indians and other nationals, because they have also more access to they can speak the language, for example, much better than Rohingyas, who are recent asylum seekers and refugees in India. So we can say that there is bridging social capital among Afghans after Putna, and there is bonding social capitals, more inward-looking networks among the Rohingyas. And I'll conclude here, and I'll leave you with some photos actually from the field work. This is the Rohingya community on the outskirts of Delhi. Again, Rohingya man showing me their papers of statelessness, actually, that they proved from the UNHCR. Another Rohingya woman, and they live usually in slum areas. And so here's an Afghani refugee in Don Bosco, an NGO working for them. And again, a group of Afghani ladies, 2 families here, and an NGO working for them. So Afghanis, on the other hand, they are more, they're seeing themselves as transients. They are here, refugees, and waiting for resettlement somewhere in the West. But the UNHCR officials say that it's kind of a dream, because only 4% of the overall refugee population in the past 3 years, only 4% have been resettled in the West. There is a big refugee crisis in the world right now, and when it comes to Afghan refugees, the options for resettlement from India is quite low. I'll stop here, and I'm expecting your questions on the topic. Thank you for listening.